What's going on, guys? It's Bromley. I'm going to talk today about a little bit of programming wisdom. I was going to do a little breakdown of German volume training, and then I ended up going down this rabbit hole where people started talking about things like junk volume and, what the upper limit of volume is before it stops being productive, if there is such a thing. And then I got into some studies and some forum arguments and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I actually got quite a bit to talk about today on that. Real quick, I did a review of Mike T's reactive training manual. That is up on my Patreon. Go ahead and check that out for exclusive content and to get your questions turned into videos. That's where I'm prioritizing all of my interaction as far as answering questions and getting a pool of ideas for my general YouTube channel. Remember, guys, base strength, it's $9.99. Get it on the Amazon store or EmpireBarbellStore.com. Appreciate your support on this. I have a new model for books. Instead of trying to stress myself out writing these longer, fleshed out fluff pieces just so I can feel like I got something that constitutes an actual book and takes me months on end to commit to writing. Instead, I'm going to be doing smaller books. They're going to be cheaper. They're going to be probably $5 to $8 moving forward, and they're going to be a lot more focused. So my goal is to get a lot of those out. I was watching Alex Becker's channel, and he said something really interesting about books sucking. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that's true. Like, if you want concise information, you want smaller, more condensed packets of information. That's why we look at YouTube videos. That's why we look at blog posts. The beauty of a book is having something that is condensed and organized. And most 200-page books are filled with filler. So I think it's in everybody's best interest. I think it's in my best interest as a writer if I stop trying to do these longer pieces. Anyway, so those will be cheaper. Those will be coming out every month or so. I'll have another one. So I'll keep you guys updated on that. Now, getting into the topic of German volume training. Many of you have come across this before. It's like a staple in training lore. It's almost like a rite of passage for so many people that at some point in their training, they try the old 10 by 10 just to see how it goes. And it can have very good effects. It can have very disastrous effects. It started in the 70s. It was really just a way to optimize what you would logically think is a driving force of growth. If you're trying to put a lot of mass on somebody or a team in a very short period of time, and if we see that volume is one of the biggest drivers of mass gain, why wouldn't you try to optimize it? And that's what German volume training is. You might, if you've come across some of my materials or if you flip through my book, I talk about different phases of training. Specifically volumizing and intensifying. Volumizing meaning that we're trying to focus on that quality. We're trying to increase volume over time. That is the stress that we're adapting to. The idea is that if we increase our ability to handle volume, we will see the type of physical changes that correspond to increased volume, namely muscle growth, and that sets kind of a foundation of mass that we can work with. We get stronger over time as we move into different phases. Intensification is just the opposite. We're prioritizing weight even at the expense of volume. Whereas weight goes up, we get more strength specific increases. We get coordination in the context of those heavier loads. We get legitimate neurological improvements that actually allow us to put out more force. So it's more strength specific. So in the context of training organization, there's a certain type of sense over time of kind of going from volume to intensity. And that's what you see driving a lot of linear periodization, a lot of training organization over time. Now we can talk about phase potentiation in the context of preparing for a contest and performing at a specific date. It makes sense to do things in a specific order. There is a little bit of doubt as to how important phase potentiation is as far as just getting growth over time. It seems to be, and this was my gut instinct all along, it's really just the variety over time. We know that even if we want to train as specific as possible, you can't just do that because diminished returns will set in. And luckily for us, there are enough different triggers for growth in the human body that we can spend time focusing on different things. It's like going on a caffeine cleanse. When caffeine stops doing it for you, like I'm at the point where these pure zero rock stars don't do shit. So if I were to go 2 weeks and let those receptors clear out, resensitize myself, let's say focus on something else as a potential stimulant, if I came back to this, it would hit me like my first time. I'd be a cheap date. It's the same thing with training. It's that tangerine, mango, guava, strawberry. That's the best one by far. Ooh, a little vodka in that. That's a morning. So if we accept that there's different markers for growth, and we want to keep ourselves growing, that means we switch back and forth. So that means we're going to be best suited if we spend some time focusing on one quality, some time focusing on another. People have gotten ridiculous with their attempts at like micromanaging how we structure these blocks, and people will focus on just completely convoluted and like overly specific type of qualities. They'll break down biological mechanisms to like a ridiculous degree, as if we can really control for how the human body adapts that specifically. You see a lot of it in strength and conditioning. Thankfully, weight training tends to be a little more one dimensional. So even when people try to do that, it usually ends up coming out looking like the same thing. So really the most amount of complexity you need when it comes to going back and forth between different phases, a little more time spent on volume, a little more time spent on intensity. And that matches up very nicely with less effort per set or per workout, more effort per set and per workout, less specific to your contest goal, more specific to your contest goal. Those all go very nice together. You don't have to really overthink it beyond that. So when it comes to volume training, if you're talking about lifters who spend a lot of time in a very strength specific range, well, you can't do that forever. You'll burn out, right? Or you'll start to regress, diminish return set in. So we look to periods of growing ourselves using volume. GVT, it's like, why not just go nuts? Why not just do all the volume and see how we do? Now, this brings up kind of a debate where people think that it's excessive or it's unnecessary. I keep seeing this stupid study cited that says, well, over 12 weeks, we showed that 5 sets of 10 was better than 10 sets of 10. Well, and this is where the whole academic component of lifting culture really starts to piss me off, is because we look at it as conclusive or at least as good enough to try and shift our opinion when we have this study that shows a clear disparity in outcomes, but we don't pay any attention to the limitations of the study. Strength training, there are so many variables, there are so many things to control for, that as soon as you start to pick these studies apart, you see how absolutely useless they are as far as something that could potentially drive our opinions. So this study in particular, was there any control for caloric intake? If you're doing twice as much volume, it stands to reason you might need more calories. No, there was absolutely no control for that. Was there any control for what they were doing outside of the gym or outside of their workouts as far as daily activity, rest, things like that? No, there was nothing for that. Was there any attempt to optimize the different protocols? This is the big one, and that's the one that I see in almost every study that I come across, is that they will have these two groups on pretty much the same schedule and they'll just change one variable. That's not how you optimize a change in training protocol. For instance, if you're going to have a comparison between maximal training and submaximal volume training, and you're going to see how they do. Well, I want to know how you did the maximal training, because we already know at this point in training history that if you just max out on the same lift every week, you're going to get a few weeks in and you're going to regress. Your nervous system can't recover from that. It creates problems, and it's something that most people have experienced, and that's why we have deloads. That's why Westside changes the stimulus. You can max out routinely if you change the stimulus, if you change the coordination involved for the movement. That's why you have something like Tusher with his reactive training systems. He has you do singles at a certain RP for so long, but after you hit that, what he calls a peak event, then you change the stimulus, you change the exercises. You do these things as a means of optimizing. It's like, okay, we're starting with this threshold. What do we need to change to make that viable and doable? And these studies do not do dick as far as optimizing. It's literally the same schedule, the same split. They just change one thing. Okay, 12 weeks progressing 10 by 10 versus 5 by 10. It stands to reason that twice the volume probably has a different recovery curve. Probably doesn't allow you to progress linearly at the same rate that you would for 5 by 10. You could surmise that the schedule they were on was appropriate for 5 by 10, but if you were going to do a 10 by 10, there might be a different schedule. You might need to deload. You might have to have some type of wavy progression where you're kind of waving up and down week to week instead of just trying to force it linearly. The fact is, there are a ton of options to make something viable. You're not going to get away with doing two wildly different protocols on the exact same schedule at the exact same rate of progression. That's dumb. So I see that study as being absolutely worthless. The other thing it doesn't take into account, which other studies don't, which all studies really don't take into account, and that is, what were these lifters doing before? Because it stands to reason that if you have a really dramatic type of training, it's going to hit people differently depending on where they are in their training career. 5 by 10's cookie cutter. That's very standard. And there's probably a reason why it is, because it works for a wide group of people. What I'm curious to know is, how would those protocols hit differently based on somebody that's used to doing 5 working sets versus somebody who's used to doing a shit ton? Take any run-of-the-mill bodybuilder, any recreational physique athlete, any gym bro who trains just because they like it. You're going to have a type of lifter who is used to a lot of work. Their capacity is going to be higher, which means their tolerance of volume is going to be higher. There's a reason bodybuilders spend hours in the gym. I'll never forget, man. It's funny, it's a small world. You guys saw that training video a couple weeks back with Russ and Brittany. Well, Brittany is Melvin Anthony's daughter. Melvin Anthony is an IFBB pro. He's been to the Olympia multiple times. He was active about 15 years ago. He's from around here. He gave a speech at junior college in one of my health classes that I was in back in 2005. And I was a pup. I was just starting to really get into training seriously. And I remember he's talking about what he did at the time with a pump. The dude had like 22-inch arms. He was massive. And I remember a kid in the class piped up and said, well, isn't it optimal to just work out for 45 minutes? Now, no doubt there were a bunch of studies that lazily suggested that people spending more time in the gym were shooting themselves in the foot. And I remember his reaction, like he wasn't rude about it, but his face was like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. This is a guy who's trying to train to an extreme, who's trying to get extreme results, who spent so much time training to grow muscle. He is now resistant to that same amount of volume that would be an immense amount of volume to anybody else. His body has adapted in such a way to grow all of this tissue that a typical amount of volume doesn't cut it. So he has to train more. He has to eat more. He has to build off of what he was doing before. And if you're a bodybuilder and you're primarily oriented towards growth, as far as muscle mass, that means volume is your primary concern. That's going to be the stress you use, the dial that you turn up. And they end up doing more exercises with more weight, with more effort, for more sets and reps. And that is how the progression happens over a training lifetime. There's no real way around that. You can't use volume to jack yourself up to 250 pounds in lean and think you're going to get to 300 pounds in lean with less volume. It's not just about the weight ticking up. The amount of work you do has to increase as well. You have to adapt to it. Now, thinking about that process, that's actually where I kind of emphasize, and I have a lot of these in base strength, these volumizing type progressions, that instead of doing the same old thing where, well, weight goes up, volume goes down. That's very limited, one-dimensional cookie cutter stuff. That's true in a competitive sense, in a very kind of 30,000 foot view. This is how my entire prep's going to go. Yes, in the beginning, you're more volume. Towards the end, you're less volume. Obviously, you're not going to be doing a shit ton of volume 2 weeks out from a meet. But as far as week to week, as far as how you grow yourself on a progression week to week, that's absolutely not the case. And I've gotten into arguments with people about this before, is that the changes in stress week to week are what cause you to grow. The progressive overload. It's that on some schedule, you are exposing yourself to more work. Now that might come linearly. It might be wavy. The Russians, the Soviets back in the day, they decoupled volume and intensity. So you might have high volume, high intensity to like medium, low to low, medium. And it was uncoupled and almost random. And basically the idea is that it all comes out in the wash, that recovery happens in an intermittent fashion. So if training does the same thing, that over a longer period of time, that's sustainable. You can adapt. For every period that you might overreach, it's followed by a period that you might over-recover, and that it all comes out that way in the end. So what I decided to do is say, okay, well, if these guys, if bodybuilders get their capacity so high, they adapt to all of this volume, it makes sense that if you're going to go through a volume phase, there should be a period of adaptation. You shouldn't take a guy who's used to singles, doubles, and triples and throw them into a 5x10 at the start of their cycle where the highest volume of the entire phase starts at week 1. That makes absolutely no sense. So that's where I came up with a kind of step loading, keeping weight about the same, ticking volume up a little bit over time, adding sets, adding reps. And then once you hit a crescendo where it becomes hard to sustain, that's when you drop back down. You lower the volume again, clear out, add a little bit of weight, repeat. And that wave cycle, it's easy to adapt to. You adapt to it very fast, these rep ranges you're not used to. It doesn't matter that it's not strength specific. That's what escapes a lot of you. Not everything you do in every session has to be specific to maxing out on a compound lift. If that were the case, that's all you would do. You wouldn't do isolation work. You wouldn't do accessory work. You wouldn't even go through volume phases. You have to adapt to capacity at some point. You have to have focused periods of time to give you a break from maximal strength specific work and to allow you to grow. That creates novelty, that keeps you fresh to that stimulus over time, and it also fixes a weakness. Not having muscle is a weakness. People focus on, well, my triceps aren't pulling their weight or my hamstrings are lagging. Not having a lot of mass is the biggest weakness and one of the ones that is easiest to remedy. If you're 6 feet tall and you're 160 pounds, the protocol that's going to get you the strongest, fastest is going to be the one that adds the most mass to your frame in the shortest period of time. It's not going to be the one that's most specific to strength. You'll get a short-term spike towards your peak, but your potential peak is so goddamn low, it doesn't matter. Where if you could add a substantial amount of mass, all of a sudden your potential peak is way higher, which means you're going to have an easier time hitting those competitive numbers. So volume is important. Adapting to volume over time is important. And this whole idea of junk volume is absolutely garbage because it reinforces this idea that there is a set optimal amount of work that is kind of universally applicable to everybody. That's trash. That doesn't even make sense. And it's something that all of these studies fail to acknowledge. Your sensitivity to a certain amount of volume is going to change wildly based on the type of lifter you are. How efficient are you at a given movement? The more inefficient you are, the more volume is going to chew you up. If you have a limb disadvantage, a leverage disadvantage, volume will chew you up a bit easier. What about your fiber makeup? What about how efficient your nervous system is? We see broadly different responses between, let's say, men and women, or very strong lifters and very weak lifters, younger lifters and older lifters, based on their tolerance to volume. So just in those populations, it's going to change a bit. Then you take into account how advanced you are. What's your training been like for the last 10 years? Have you specifically gone towards one end of the training spectrum? Have you spent most of your time with singles, doubles, and triples? Is that what you're adapted to? Well, that's going to have different implications for how much volume you can tolerate before you dig yourself into a hole that's too deep to get out of. The fact is, what you can respond to and how well it's going to work is entirely dependent on you, what you're adapted to, what you've done before. And that's different for every single person, which is why training is always, always, always a matter of setting a baseline of work, seeing how you respond to it, and ticking forward. I'm going to do a review of Mike T's emerging strategies coming up pretty soon. But that was one of the biggest kind of aha moments that I've had in recent years, where he laid out, he has lifters start with the same workout every week for multiple weeks. The only way that weight goes up is if your strength goes up from one week to the next, because it's the same reps at the same RPE. So if your rate of perceived exertion changes because you got stronger, then the weight goes up. It doesn't go up otherwise. So you're talking about same threshold, same sets and reps, same exercises for weeks on end. And it's not until things become stagnant, because even though diminished returns do set in, you're still ticking up a little bit week to week until that happens. When things get stagnant, when you stop progressing, boom, that's when you switch. And that really drove home that point that training, those training decisions, as he calls them, emergent strategies, doing what's appropriate for the individual, is entirely dependent on the individual. Their time frame is going to be different. The amount of work they can handle and get away with is going to be different. There aren't set amounts of volume that are appropriate. There might be broad guidelines that are useful if you're having a team, if you're trying to find the Goldilocks zone for like 100 football players. But for the individual, it's going to differ wildly. For the vast majority of you who are not lifetime specific power lifters, and you are trying to find a quick way to add mass, get a little bit stronger, if you adapt to a greater amount of volume than what you've been doing before, you're going to grow. And think about it this way. Think about trying to get your triceps to grow if they've been lagging. Let's say you've been doing 5 sets of 10 for a few months on skull crushers, and it's not elbow pain, it's not limitation. You've just hit a wall. You can't progress weight on it. They're not growing. They're not responding. Well, what's the next step? The next step is more work. The next step is a greater stress. Why does that have to come in the form of just piling weight on? Eventually you can't. Eventually, if you're stagnant, your body won't allow you to add weight and won't respond to that. Add more volume. Find a level of volume that allows you to grow without overtraining. Once you do that, you might be very surprised at how much volume is actually required to get a stubborn body part to grow, and it might fall way outside of the realm of what we're doing with the typical prescription. So just think about that for a second. So my experience with German volume training, I remember doing it as a kid. Remember I said it's like one of those rite of passage things. I was a teenager, and the protocol we followed was a minute rest, which I probably don't recommend people do that. The weight's going to be very light. It's going to be great for building muscular endurance, a little bit of cardiovascular endurance. It's great for conditioning, but it might be too much bias towards that side of the spectrum. You'll still grow from it, but you might need a couple minutes, especially with things like squatting. But man, 225, I remember we tried it with a minute rest. Me and my buddy both ended up puking. But even that was a byproduct of jumping in cold. We weren't used to that threshold. We went in hard without building a foundation. If we started slower, if we worked towards those short rest periods, or if we worked towards that weight instead of just jumping in what we thought we could do, probably would have had a better result. But even now, like I said, I use volumizing techniques, and I've had people get towards impressive volumes. I've had people start at 3x12 and work up to something like 7x10, steadily ticking the weight up in the process. So we'll kind of go up for a few weeks, come down, build back up. And everybody hates it, especially with compound movements. It works so well. I actually had a kid cancel on me because in the first 4 weeks, He was complaining about the stretch marks he got on his ass and shoulders from the rapid growth. Now, to him, he was having a complex about the aesthetics of stretch marks. To me, I'm like, well, if you grow, that's going to happen anyways. I think I did my job. So anyways, guys, that's my rant on GVT and junk volume. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment box. Till next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.